Okay, cool. Well, thanks. What I wanted to do was just capture a bunch of thoughts that you could argue I was just not, whatever, too lazy to put in an issue, but more pointedly, it's really complicated and spans like a whole bunch of different issues. And so I wanted to sort of just transfer knowledge as much as I could. This affects verify more than release. So it's unfortunate Brendan couldn't be on it, but at least he gets to watch the video later. But I wanted to sort of do a dump sort of knowledge transfer of this content and the issues that we currently have. Oh, Jason, can you not hear me? I can hear you, Jason.
You can hear me now. Okay, good. Windows troubleshooter fixed it. Sorry for the interruption.
All right, no problem. Did you hear any of the stuff before then?
Okay. I could hear you. I just, it wasn't hearing me.
Okay, good. All right, well, so, yeah, so I just wanted to at least do a knowledge transfer, but then also try to capture some of the things that have been in my head that I haven't written down or articulated, because there's this interplay between like 4 or 5 or even more issues that in my mind make this beautiful direction, but is like totally unobvious. And I wanted to at least have an attempt at starting to articulate it and see if we can, get this written down somewhere so that it makes sense. Unfortunately, I don't have the links handy. So I'm gonna have to just start Googling for something. Like the directed acyclic graph issue. And hopefully everything is kind of, hopefully I can find this all really quickly here. I'll just start sharing screen. That's weird. That's sharing the wrong, no, what is that sharing? I'm sharing the wrong thing.
Yeah, I was just sharing a white bar.
Yeah, I don't know why I had a little white bar, but there we go. Okay, so here you can watch my Google foo.
Hey, friend, sorry I'm late.
Oh, there you are, Brendan, awesome. Well, just really quickly get you up to speed. I wanted to basically just do a knowledge transfer on a bunch of issues to at least sort of explain what they were about, because some of these issues are like 2 years old, but then also try to pull them together and see if I can create a story about how they fit together to create like a really, what I believe is a really compelling vision of how to move forward. So I'm just pulling up a couple of issues right now to see, to start off. But unfortunately I did this before. Actually, Brendan, I know we just went through this. Do you happen to have the thread where I linked to like, oh, and this one's related to this and this and this?
Oh, I think I know what you're talking about.
Yeah. I mean, I should be able to find them from the related issues, so maybe I'll start with that. But yeah, actually, there's a bunch of ones here that are already related. I'll jump in. Okay, so the topic here is like how a bunch of pieces play together, but directed acyclic graphs, and then actually, I'll give you a little bit of a story here too, because this was sort of the start of my tracking this inspiration, and then a bunch of things sort of distilled down. We have a bunch of users that find our artifacts and caching and things like that to be really confusing. They don't know when to use what. We end up using artifacts for inter-job communication, so that you have one job that builds a thing and then another job that tests it. Well, you need to pass the thing that you're going to test as an artifact. But then we also use artifacts for like, okay, after the whole thing is done, now this is the build that you should download to get the software. In those cases, it's nice and simple, like, oh, they're both artifacts, same thing. But it's not always that way. Sometimes like you need a job and like, oh, you just need to pass this one piece of information to the next job. And it's like a text file, or it's a variable, or it's a something else. And like artifact feels like the wrong thing. And anyway, lots of people have confusion And a lot of times, actually, the content between the things is just files. And it's really like, I have one job that, for example, like does a bundle install. And then I have another job that actually does a run of the thing. But if you're not careful, well, then all the files you just downloaded in the bundle install disappear. And it's really confusing people. And you can try to use cache, because that's what logically people think about. But then sometimes cache fails because it's the best effort basis. It's the cache, right? It's not a permanent record. It's not a guaranteed record. It's supposed to be just like sort of like, if there's enough a space, then you cache. So then like it'll work sometimes, but then occasionally like, oh, you don't have cache this time, and then my second job fails. People are just really confused. And the answer, of course, is these artifacts, but people are really confused by that because like this is really heavy. And like on my local machine, all I would do is just type these 2 commands and the space would be consistent. So people have questions about like, how do I get started? So for a while we talked about like, should there be some way where you automatically store content from one stage to the next stage? In the end, I'll just jump through a little bit faster, is Workspaces. Circle CI actually came up with this. I think it's brilliant. I think they did a really good job. I haven't looked at the technical details and things like that, but the conception is just that you just say like, oh, well, here's this workspace, and everything that you do, everything you modify in that workspace will just be passed on to the next job, and then the next job, and the next job. And so rather than, like, for a while we had these sticky runners, we said like, oh, you've got to run, like if you run it in one job, then have a second job, and it would be run in the same runner. And then that way, like if you loaded files in one runner, you have those files in the second job on that same runner. And that's fine, but like that only works if you've got a single like parallelism, right? You've got one runner, like there's no way to sort of do multiple jobs in parallel that all use the same runner. You'd have to then sequentialize them. And so while it's nicer, it's conceptually nicer, it's not nearly as effective. And in particular, there's this jarring sort of move where you start off and I'm like in this simple mode, and then like, oh, now I hit this thing where I really want to add parallelism, and they're like, oh, now you got to learn this other mode. And some of our competitors actually do that. They have like one product only does single, and then if you want multiple, well, that's a different product. I really wanted to avoid that, and I think that Workspaces is a really great way to do it, because there's not like, you can just start off and say, well, the simple mode is that everybody shares a workspace by default, or maybe not even by default. Maybe you have to declare it because we're backwards compatible. But the point is to be like, oh, with the one little declaration, I've got works.
Oh, you lost your audio there for a second, Mark.
Yeah, I know. Sorry, I'll switch over to this. Even though there's 31% left in my AirPod, it still just decides to disconnect every once in a while.
Seems that's happening to everybody who's got them at the company.
Yeah, especially as they get older. I think they literally batteries are dying. Anyway, so I think Workspaces is just a really elegant solution for it, because it's like one line declaration, and then now it does behave differently, but it's intuitive, it's understandable, or whatever. So I feel like it's a really particularly good solution to the problem of, I want to just get started and not worry about caching and artifacts, just make it easy, but also be really powerful so that I can do multiple parallelism. I don't need to worry about using the same runner over and over. I don't have to buy a machine to have my state. Because that's the other thing, people coming from like a Jenkins kind of thing, they've got a machine and it's like, oh, well, you did the bundle install, like everything's cached because it's just a directory structure using the same directory every time you do a run. And it's a really easy mental model because it's an extension of my local machine. It behaves just like my local machine would. But it's just not good. We know that there's huge problems. Like then I run my job once and I run it again and I've got different behavior. Oh, because somebody else ran a bundle install differently and they did something different. You're like, what? Like things shouldn't be that brittle. So I really love that we've got this repeatable thing. Anyway, Workspaces is a really good answer. And Circle CI specifically did it in such a way where you can have parallelism, and then I think it might even like do a union of the file systems afterwards. But however it is, they've solved this problem so that like if you touch a file in one stage, then the next stage will get the changes to that file. But if you don't touch anything, then great, like you just pull in the things. And it's relatively efficient, and you don't have to worry about using the same runner. So it's a good solution. But the other side of that is, so that's the easy side, like The other side of CI is like, okay, now I want a really advanced one. And this is where like, okay, I've gone way beyond just having a single pipeline. I've got lots of parallelism, but now parallelism is even wrong. Like that's not enough. I now need I need a directed acyclic graph. I need to be able to have really complicated stuff that I don't want to wait for everything to be lockstep. I want it to be as efficient as possible. And I want to be able to if I'm going to build iOS and Android at the same time, if iOS succeeds, I'm going to call that success and still deploy the iOS, even if the Android one fails. Whereas our current pipelines is well, if the builds fails for either one, then builds just stop. And people are like, no, I want this more capability. So directed acyclic graphs is a good solution to that. So anyway, it started from a long time ago having these musings on how we solve the simple case, how we solve the advanced case. And I believe that these two things, these small primitives, are really great at solving this in a really, really elegant way. Like Workspaces is actually a really powerful tool, but also just makes things really, really simple. And the way that I've specifically talked about the directed acyclic graphs, because you've got smart defaults, makes it so that if I don't want to deal with directed acyclic graphs, I just want to say, oh, this is just, I would just declare my stages. Then it works exactly as it is. But if I want to say, oh, but now I want to have an exception. I want to actually have this not depend on all the results of this previous stage. I want it to depend on one specific job of this previous stage. So kick it off as soon as that one's done. Well, then you just declare a specific predecessor or triggered by, or some other word, dependency, and I just declare a smaller dependency than the default. But then also within a stage, being able to say, well, what if I've got two jobs in a stage that depend on each other? Well, then they'll just have to happen in sequence. But it's really easy. The default would be they would just both work in lockstep. But by just declaring a different dependency, now suddenly I've got directed acyclic graphs. If you really have a complicated graph, then it might mean you've got now complicated CI, or YAML rather. But at least it's well, the complication goes with complication. The simple case is still simple. So I think these two primitives are really, really powerful. The predecessor thing and the workspaces thing. I'm going to basically ignore workspaces from now on. The rest of the things now branch off into really interesting areas. When we start talking about the predecessors, whatever we call it, the dependency, then it gets really interesting when you start talking about multi-project pipelines, and then also when you talk about artifacts, because they all kind of dovetail together. If we have a mechanism to say that this job depends on this other job, well, what does it depend on? Does it depend on the successful completion of that job? Does it depend on the artifact that job produced? We already have a mechanism that actually declares that this job depends on that artifact. And by default, every job depends on every artifact. So if you don't specify anything, you just get all the artifacts that are produced, but you can narrow it down and say, well, I only depend on this one artifact. So then there's this logical question of, well, once I've got that, why don't I just say, well, then let's start running as soon as that artifact is available. Why don't I use it for not just the data, the artifact, but also the triggering mechanism? The obvious failure mode there, though, is let's say I've got build, test, and deploy, and really simple pipeline, right? But my deploy clearly depends on the build artifact. And maybe the test stage also has artifacts, it's got JUnit XML output, right? And I don't need, my deploy doesn't need the JUnit XML artifact, but does need to be triggered when the tests work. Because otherwise, if I just said, well, as soon as the build is done, let's start deploying it, you've totally sidestepped the security of the CI pipeline. That doesn't make any sense. So that deployed job actually depends on the artifact from build and the result from test. And so then you got to okay, how do we do this? How do we deal with the complexity? One way is to decouple them completely and decouple data from triggering or flow, if you want to call it that. But I've actually just recently, and not captured this from writing, one of the reasons I'm having this conversation is, I feel like you can actually make some assumptions here that would be pretty darn reasonable. What if I said the deploy job depends on build and test? And then, yeah, what if test does spit out a JUnit XML and you send it to the deploy job as well? How bad would it be if, it would be kind of annoying if it actually ended up deploying the XML, but it's not a huge file. And presumably you're not actually deploying like star, you're deploying a certain path. So in practice, it's a little bit wasteful, but the cognitive load of it is just so much lighter that if I just said, oh, this deploy job depends on these two things, then therefore I will get the artifacts from both of those and I will wait until both of those things trigger properly. But if, for whatever reason, I wanted to say, oh, but I've got this other pipeline over here, you know, I've got an Android build and I've got an iOS build, and I declare the dependencies, and you realize that, oh, the iOS build, the iOS deploy does not depend on the Android build, well then great, it's free to run as quickly as possible. So the cognitive load of that deployment, like of the model, is really, really light, with the caveat that there's a certain amount of cost involved. The reason this is important, though, is that means we can potentially get away with one keyword and just say, as an MVC, we just overload that keyword and just say, look, now use dependency in this other way, and it means something else. There's a backwards compatibility problem that we're gonna have to work through, because right now, if I do have build, test, and deploy, and I literally declare dependency on that other thing, I don't want to suddenly break my build because I now start deploying because I've changed the definition. You can't change the definition of dependency. So maybe we have to still make another word for this, but maybe this becomes the successor for dependency. You know, we talked about needs as one of the things. Like, what if we declared needs as the successor to all of this and just say needs says, oh, I need the artifact from here, or I need the trigger. And then we can evolve it if and when necessary to have another, like, oh, when I've declared this job, maybe then I can tell, well, what do I need from that job? And I could say, well, do I need the artifact? Do I need the success status? Do I need something else from that? Maybe, in fact, I need the failure status. I mean, that's something we don't talk about very often, but we have a failure mechanism right now, but it's at the stage level. And a lot of people need more granularity there. I need to be able to say, this job failed, go ahead and send a Slack notification. But that doesn't mean you stop the pipeline. Like, you keep going, and the rest of the pipeline might succeed. So now we may need failure at an individual job level. So there could be some way where we evolve a new keyword to encompass all of these types of dependencies. And then, of course, now multi-project. Well, what if I just say I need, and I reference a job in another pipeline? Awesome. And then now you've got the same thing, though. Now, because if we've built this sprawl primitives nicely, as they layer on top of each other, as soon as I say, well, now I'm referencing another pipeline, well, great, but also now pull that artifact from that pipeline. Boom, I've grabbed the artifact. And then that way you've got this, instead of having to like, oh, now cross-project pipelines are a different keyword and they all behave differently. The smaller primitives add up, and you've got a really nice way to do cross-project pipelines. So I feel like, again, these two keywords end up solving, yes, there is an issue for needs. There's several issues, unfortunately. So one of the reasons to try to do this is to try to conjoin these things back. Anyway, so I'm not saying this is like a mandate or whatever, but it's possible if we said, look, we've got just one way of doing this backwards looking declaration. We've also got forward looking, right? We've got triggers, which is a whole different thing. But we've got this one way of doing backwards looking dependencies, and we've unified it to handle both artifacts and logic and success failure logic. And that just seems more powerful. There's also another edge to consider here, which are things like, say, Docker images. Right now, we don't, like, artifacts are completely separate from Docker images. But in many ways, Docker images are, in fact, artifacts. But there's no way for us to just simply declare and say, I depend on this Docker image. I mean, you have to name it, and like you just have to make, if one produces it with a certain name, then the other thing needs to consume it with that name. But it'd be kind of really nice to just be able to say, this thing spits out a Docker image, this other thing consumes that Docker image as an artifact. And so if there's some other way, and I don't have a good proposal for this, but if there's some other way that we can fold in all of the rest of our like Docker image, but also the rest of our binary management, all of package management into the artifact system. And again, maybe the current artifact keyword is only file-based. I don't know if that's that keyword, but there's some kind of thing which is like, using the artifact as a generic term, this is the output of a job. It can either be files, it could be binaries that get uploaded to a package registry, it could be container images, maybe it could be other things, I don't know. But all of those things are outputs, and I need to then pass those outputs as inputs into some other job. I'd love to see some way to unify that stuff together, especially then if we can relate to this whole needs thing, because then you can get in some really interesting stuff like, oh, I just built another Docker image on this other cross-project pipeline, and somehow like that triggers this thing because that new image was there, or that image failed to upload, and so that causes this other trigger to happen. Like there's some really interesting, actually, as we look at sort of on the secure side, there's the auto remediation, which has all this kind of dependency stuff. Like I've got a gem file, or I've got a gem file that says I declare dependency on these gems. If there's a new version of that gem, test it and see if my stuff still runs. I can imagine some world where that's folded into the needs thing effectively as well, but using maybe some underlying mechanism that's the same. And like, oh, I'm actually depending on the Docker image that this other thing updates. And if somehow a new Docker image is available, probably using some regex, like it has to be a version matching thing. It can't just be a SHA or an internal thing. But if there is a new released version of the Docker image for this module, then boom, that should just trigger a whole new pipeline. And I should then consume that and test it. And it'd be really interesting to tie all those things together. Okay, I know I'm going really fast. And I also know we've only got 2 more minutes, so I'm gonna kind of just dump a few more things here then. Now let's get back into sort of the directed. Are you trying to talk, Brendan?
Sorry, no, actually I'm in the room with Josh too, so I was
okay.
quickly bringing him to where we were. Sorry, go ahead.
Okay, so then let's get to the pipeline stuff. So the thing here is that the directed acyclic graph, let's expand on that one more, it can get really complicated syntactically to start declaring all these, to declare like things that in a lot of people's minds would be really independent things. Like I've got an iOS pipeline and an Android pipeline, and they're not related except that they just happen to share a code base. Maybe that's a little bit too extreme because you probably should design them similarly. You're probably going to use Fastlane for both, that kind of stuff. But I might have a mono repo with 20 different services in it that's all one repo, and each one of those services has their own deployment mechanisms, literally potentially to different clouds with their own styles, whatever. Like they're completely independent and people want to be able to edit them independently. And so we've got a bunch of issues about having multiple pipelines defined. And again, my current belief is that if we go down the primitive of the directed acyclic graph, that's the key to being able to do multiple pipelines. But in order to make it syntactically nice, we can talk about like this pipeline thing. So I'm going over, I realize, does anybody have a hard stop? I can keep going, I'm just eating into my lunch. All right.
Yeah, I'm good to keep going. Sorry, I was just getting
Okay.
my calendar.
I'll try to speed it up though if I can. So people want to be able to manage pipelines as like sort of discrete things though. And we've seen from like GitHub Actions and Bitbucket pipes and several other things that people want to be able to incorporate and reuse third-party declarations. Now, most of those other tools are still at the job level. Like I'm going to reuse this one deployment job or this one test job. And I think of this as more than that, like whole pipelines. But there are definitely 2 lenses. There's a third-party sharing, and there's just purely like within a company, like the monorepo example, I've got different services, and they each need a pipeline. Now we could go ahead and like, a lot of the proposals are things like, well, let's put a .gitlab CI YAML in each subdirectory, and then we'll just run multiple pipelines. And we could do that. But another way potentially to do it is just to have still one GitLab CI YAML declaration, but then split out the files. We have an include capability. You could say, well, include the service pipeline from this service, include the service pipeline for this service, and include all of these. And then you amalgamate them together, and that's your massive pipeline. That's fine, and it will be functional, but it's cognitive load. Because once you declare the pipeline, like, well, visualization is going to look like one massive pipeline, but maybe that's okay. But in particular, editing it is going to be hard. Like you now need to make sure, like, oh, like it's like everybody's working in a global namespace. Like you've got, oh, I named this job, and that now conflicts with this other job, and now I just overloaded it because the way YAML works, it'll just merge the things together and doesn't throw a syntax error. It just does weird stuff. And so it's just going to be really, really hard. So pipeline is a proposal for, and maybe it's an iteration of include, I don't know, but maybe it's an alternate, maybe it's just another keyword that's a type of include, I don't know. But specifically, my thought process there is akin to a function call with local variables. Like if I include a pipeline, then treat that pipeline, anything that's declared locally, just treat it independently. And so like maybe even to the extent that like I've got jobs that are declared, I've got stages that are declared, but those are like independent stages. And they don't conflict with, actually that may be too far, but variables is particularly the thing. Like I want to declare a variable that is used within this pipeline, but I don't want that variable to leak over in every other pipeline I've got. I want a local variable. Probably I'll also have some resolution about like job names and stuff like that. Good. But basically something along those lines where, and this needs a little bit more flesh, but there's something here where if I can treat that pipeline as a whatever, an atomic unit, I guess, it helps the case where people just have a monorepo of multiple services that they need declaration, but it also might help the third party in the marketplace. Like I could just package up a pipeline, put it out there, and then you just say, oh, and I'm just going to reference that pipeline and it's just going to do it. And then, you can pass in a few variables to customize it. Just like a function call, you got to be able to pass variables in, and then there's also variables internally that are local. It's all about scope. I feel like there's something really interesting there. But again, it's all just going to be related to, in the end, they're just going to be directed acyclic graphs. It's just that graph, like everything that's in that pipeline would have an assumed trigger, like a predecessor or a needs, and that needs would be just scoped to the pipeline file. And so if I say that my deploy stage depends on test, well, but that's only the test as defined in this file. And it's not going to depend on some other test stage. It's only going to depend on there. So again, it's still using the primitives of the directed acyclic graph, but it's just giving now a syntactic way of making that cleaner. And, and I can imagine a couple of other enhancements. One simple enhancement would be when you do the include or the pipeline, instead of just referencing a specific file, like what if I just reference a directory or a pattern and say, look for this like directory /star or star.yaml or whatever the hell. And then I could just be like, oh, if you want to add a new pipeline, then all you need to do is just add it into this directory. And then now you've declared a new pipeline. At some level, like you'd have this really, like the top level GitLab CI YAML could be really, really trivial. It's just look for anything under the next directory structure. In fact, you could potentially go farther and say, what if I looked for like .gitlab, well, maybe that's the wrong place. Maybe I'd look at like */.gitlab CI YAML. Like I can put a regex there, and basically when the thing runs, it'll just look for all the subdirectories and look for a GitLab CI YAML that's in that top level, which is exactly what customers asked for. But we've done it by doing these small primitives and saying, well, look, all you have to do is like, if that's how you want to operate, great, you declare a GitLab CI YAML this way, and we'll have it documented. And then now, hey, every subdirectory under here is treated as an independent project. But we don't have to build that in as a first-class citizen. It's just, oh, that's just the nature of this building on these small primitives. And because we use star patterns, it just makes it really trivial. Because what will happen is like, well, whatever. We don't necessarily want to say, oh, the right way to do this is any directory that has a GitLab CI YAML spins up a separate thing. Personally, I'd rather just sort of build on what we've got and let you get to there, but using smaller primitives, I guess, is the most important part. So anyway, so I think that pulls in a bunch of the areas, and that was the topics today. There's a couple actually more topics I want to sort of get into about variables and some other kinds of stuff, but that was the topic I wanted to capture today. Thoughts, questions, shouts of WTF?
No, I mean, I like it. There's definitely a higher level like view here. I'm still grokking, and I've started like a notes document where I'm trying to grok some of it. Like I can both see an argument for like, I think the hard part right now in my head is like, and the answer is it's because it's a different idea, but like how is needs different than dependencies, and how is pipeline different than include? And well, the reason right now is because it's this very expanded view of like what we could do with it, right? and so I guess maybe I'm thinking too small, too fast, but I'm like, okay, how do we get there?
Right, and that's actually the trick. And some of these things are because of needs versus dependencies. Since dependencies exist today, but needs versus triggered by versus predecessor.
Right.
There are three different proposals.
Mm-hmm.
The word there is irrelevant. Like you could substitute the word in for any of these.
Obviously.
But it's just a snapshot in time of like triggered by is specifically about multi-project pipelines, but there's also this conversation around cross-project dependencies.
Yes.
And there's another one then about within project triggers. And it's just like, well, if you unify them all together, you can use one keyword. And then now it's just purely like a backwards compatibility and an evolution thing of like, we maybe can't use the word dependencies. Dependencies might be the perfect word, but you can't break functionality.
Right.
So therefore we come up with a new word.
Yeah.
Whereas on the other side, include and pipeline is exactly the same deal. Like maybe we can in fact just extend, and in fact, I've seen it now, include has been extended to have all sorts of, like it used to just be include was a string. And now it's an array of different kinds of hashes, and you can have all sorts of different kinds of things. So it can be really easy to just be like, let's add another Boolean to that structure that says, treat this as an encapsulated pipeline with local variables.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or for that matter, maybe you even go the opposite direction and say in the include itself, maybe you have a top level declaration, like you have a global namespace declaration. And if you declare that namespace, then every variable under here sort of gets namespaced under there. And maybe that's even the right way. Maybe so include is literally the same, and it's just some other mechanism by which if this file happens to be included, it will then behave, the way that we talk about. The difference is, and actually, I'm going to go one more meta here. There's also extends. Mm-hmm. When we first did includes, the product vision that I asked for, we delivered something very different for good technical reasons, but we needed to then do extends in order to make the functionality work. But, and so that's where like, oh, let's make another third variable, another keyword rather, sorry, not a variable, to like, oh, let's make it this way. But the reality is, there's probably a rewrite and possible to say, okay, let's actually just make includes do all this. But I don't know. But last time we looked at it, we decided to go with extends as a separate keyword. But pipelines might not be the same argument. Maybe pipelines is just let's augment includes with this capability. So don't focus on the syntax matters. The capability.
No, yeah, and I'm not focused on that. It was a way of like describing like my thoughts. Like, no, I'm not hung up on what the word should be.
Right, exactly. So for me, the important part was if we do pipelines this way, and they're all independent, decoupled small primitives. So we could do a directed acyclic graph with existing includes. It's just that it's going to be a little bit painful because you now need, like you're all working in the same global namespace. So pipelines, or that capability of local namespaces, is just a nicety to be like, oh, now just boom, we've just done the right thing. But we could do these all independently. Like that's one of the things I love about this whole thing. Like we can do workspaces, we can do needs, and we can do pipelines in any order because they all add value independently. But when you put them together, it fulfills this vision of this is what like an advanced pipeline or a really simple pipeline needs.
Yeah, and yeah, so that's where I've grokked like the first part, like the needs part is like trying to like up level my thoughts on that. It's like a job has outputs, right? Like, and status is an output. The GitLab binary artifact thing is an output. The cache is an output. Any of our packages to our package repository is an output. Any the workspace or some action I take on the workspace, if there were workspaces, would be an output. And so, yeah, this concept of needs is like, okay, what, back to your like the JUnit job versus the build job. It's like for my deploy, I need the status of the JUnit job to be passed, and I need the build to have an artifact published, right? And so that's kind of how I've gronked need into the general thing we're doing is what of the various kinds of outputs of the job, which right now are very disparate, right? Like there's no way to unify. Needs is the unification of this is declaratively what I need. I was trying not to use that word. but
Yeah.
these are the outputs of the job that are required for me to run my job.
Right. Exactly.
But there's also a component of needs are what you need to start, but there might be some other trigger that says what you need to finish, right? Like you could say, to Mark's point about deployment, you could say, I've got the package I've built, I'm going to start the process and jobs in deploy, but not finish or officially finish deploy until I get the results from test. Because there's like the whole point of acyclic graphs is that you can use those dependencies to determine proper sequencing or efficient sequencing. And if you have two separate types of dependencies, one for when we start and one for when we end, you can be a lot more efficient in how you sequence.
Right.
Well, it's interesting though, the way you described that is a little bit problematic because we don't have, like, I think what you mean by that is an end, like, oh, before you deploy, check to make sure that the test succeeded. But the reality is that our jobs are atomic in some sense. That's the wrong phrase. Our jobs are only triggered. There's nothing like in the middle of a job, we're going to be like, okay, I'm going to do half these steps and then I'm going to wait. If you need to wait, you break them up into two jobs. So you have one job that builds the Docker image, and then you have another job that deploys that Docker image, let's say. Or maybe at most you'd have a job that prepares a bunch of stuff and then a job that actually executes. But technically speaking, I don't think you can say, we need this thing before you can end. It's, no, we need this thing before something new is triggered. Does that make sense?
It does. What's the difference then? If you're saying the actions that I would take are the same regardless of whether I declared a dependency as a needs or depends, is that the two words we're using? Whatever the two different words are that are describing a dependency. If the actions you are going to take from those are exactly the same, whether or not you declared it one way or another, what's the difference between the two of those?
Honestly, I'm not following the question. Let me see if
I think I follow it. I think it's so it's the difference between one waiting at the end and just kind of continuously running and waiting versus the next job waiting to start.
Well, and I guess let me think about it in terms of graphs. Graphs are states and transitions between states, and you declare dependencies between those, and that is what creates a graph. If we're saying we want to create another type of definition of dependency, but it's the action I'm going to take with that distinction is the same. If I still wait for the other one to start before I move, then it's still the same dependency. What's the value in me calling it a different type of dependency?
Right. So it's purely about backwards compatibility. So
okay.
If we have, so in all cases, it's about the trigger and it's a dependency, and it's saying like what conditions need to be necessary for this thing to start. Right now, the problem is we have a word called dependencies, and that is defined as when you start, go and fetch the artifacts from this job. And so if we now change the definition of what dependencies mean to be about triggers, because it was not about triggers, it was purely about the data. But if you now say, oh, well, as soon as you have, like if literally I say I've got build, test, and deploy, and I've got a deploy job that depends on build, if we change the definition of depends, or dependencies, then it would start running in parallel with the test, and it would deploy before the tests finish. So you would be breaking people's flow because you changed the definition. That's the only reason we're talking about adding a new keyword. What I'm suggesting is we could add a new keyword and deprecate the old one. We could say dependencies is no longer a word that we want to use. You can continue using it until GitLab 13.0, but going forward, you should use needs. And literally, maybe we make it so you could just do a G sub and swap it out if you understand what the ramifications are.
Gotcha. Okay.
Right, but you
it's
now
still
need to think
one
about
singular
triggers.
definition of dependency. Okay.
Right. So what it means is that the deploy job previously only needed to declare the build because it automatically had a flow based on, the previous stage had to finish. And now you would have to specifically say, well, no, I depend on build and test. You'd have to be explicit about, you'd have to be comprehensive. You'd have to, like, if you stated a dependency, you have to state all your dependencies, whereas some of them were still implied today, or still are implied.
Yeah, because today we have a simple implied graph. It is not a
Right.
complex graph. But there
Right,
is a
yeah,
graph
we're
today of
sticking-
stage.
It's still a
to
graph.
stage.
Just
It still is a graph. It's just a simple graph.
Right.
And so, yeah, no, I'm with you on that.
exactly. So anyway, so in many ways, I think that needs, to me, it's pretty obvious that it could just be a replacement for this. Not saying it has to be, right? We could still, one of the options on the table is decouple these things and declare data separately from flow. In that world, test would just declare, I need, or predecessor or prerequisite. I would have a predecessor as my test job, but that's implied, so I probably would never specify it. But if I really wanted to, I could. And then separately declare, oh, but I also depend on data in this one. But then clearly, if I'm depending on data, well, then that job has to finish. So there's actually, you're already in this weird thing where like dependencies have an implied trigger as well. But I guess it's, you either have a situation where it's possible for the wrong thing to happen. We're like, oh, you've broken the things, or you say that you've got an implied dependency. I'm just saying that because these things are so closely related, using one mechanism kind of makes sense. But sometimes, like from a developer experience perspective, a UX perspective, it might make more sense cognitively to treat them as two separate things. Like, because honestly, for months, for maybe even literally a year, I was in that boat where I was saying, look, these are two different things. Like trigger and data, two different flows. Like they shouldn't be correlated. And now I'm just saying that, but there's like a 70% correlation between these things. So like, why not just make that the default? And then if you deviate from that default, then, let me declare this separately. Like if I said that deploy depends on test and build, it would work. It's just that I also have this extra XML file that I don't need. But like, you know what? I'd be willing to do that. And then at some point I'm like, oh, that's a bit of a pain. Great. Then make this exclusion and say, okay, yes, I depend on this for the data, or for the trigger, but not the data. But then like I'm progressively, as I'm getting more complicated or more advanced, then I add the syntax instead of the other way around. So I like that as a single flow. And then I especially like being able to say, oh, well, I've got this need on build, or hey, I've got need on build from a different pipeline, or hey, I've got need for this Docker image from this registry, or I've got need for this gem file over here. So if a new version of that gem is ever published, just automatically re-trigger this again. Like maybe there's even some way where I say needs, and I point to a gem file. And like, that's the way I declare it. That'd be kind of dumb because I'd want to just be able to turn it on for budget. But I could imagine that as an MVC at some point and saying like, oh, I'm just going to point to a gem file, and every referenced gem in there, I'm just going to automatically add into a watch list and literally set up notifications from the NPM registry or the Ruby Gems registry or the Docker Hub. And whenever those things modify, I'm just going to go and trigger a new build and consume the latest item.
Yeah, and let me try to say this. Like you're saying, if I'm declaring needs and I have both a need for an artifact and let's say an artifact or a result. If I write down I need the result from test and I need the artifact from build, there's no sequencing change for me there. It's just being declarative about what components I need from various ones. So maybe then in test, I throw away the artifacts more quickly.
Right.
Or don't put them into the next stage. Okay.
Right, exactly. But again, we could do progressive enhancement here and say, if you really want to say, okay, like I don't want to grab that artifact, then say, okay, I don't need that artifact. Or maybe I declare what I do need at a more granular level. I need success of this thing. Like if I just said, I need this job, we would assume you need success and the artifacts. Yeah. But maybe I can override that and say, oh no, I need failure of this job. Okay, well then we'll set that up and only on failure will you get triggered. Or I need success without the artifact. And be like, great, we have some syntax for doing so. But by default, we'll just kind of do the logical thing, which is like, oh, you probably need any artifacts that it generates. And especially if you throw into like workspaces and stuff, then the artifacts are just like, oh, maybe you just have an artifact, like you don't even use artifacts at all. That's one of the things when we're now finally bringing workspaces back. Right now we declare artifacts for things that we may not normally need to do. If we just said, oh, this is a workspace, then you'd automatically get the workspace when your job runs. And so then I wouldn't need to declare a dedicated needs. I would just naturally get the right workspace content. And so then I would only really ever declare things that are sort of I don't know, not obvious. Actually, maybe I would just even forget about artifacts because it would just be in I would just know that I'd have it in my workspace, and then it would really be more about the triggers altogether.
Yeah, and I think if you have that definition of being able to determine the needs, there's also the potential for the types of needs that if there's a failure, your ability to restart in the middle is much higher if you know, like, oh, in this one, all I needed was the artifact, and the artifact was broken or whatever, and so I can just pick that up and take it through.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right, but by being also explicit, it's like, well, but then let's rebuild and let's test that artifact again because I still need the success of this, but I may not need the documentation that was generated or whatever. And
or like the code linting or something like there's
right, exactly. Well,
yeah,
that might be part of it, but again, if you look at like the iOS and the Android scenario, if I wanted to rerun the pipeline to redeploy the iOS, I don't have to also redeploy the Android. We could backport and say, look, this is how far we need to go. Great, now we've got this artifact and we know what to do with it. Or, oh, that artifact was deleted. Like if I, a month later, hit retry, but the artifact's already gone, we can actually deduce what exactly we need to do because everything is deterministic.
Right.
So I think that's really, really valuable. And then it gets interesting, again, when you talk about cross-project and stuff like that. Like you can say, I've got this dependency over there and whatever gets really interesting. And then I'm going to throw out one more thing about the needs then is like you could also do regex kind of stuff and say, well, I'm going to watch this, again, this Docker image registry, and maybe I got a file regex and say like anything that is like dash or like tagged with V and then a number. Like, okay, take those ones, but anything that doesn't have a V, don't take those. And so I'll just build anytime there's a V. Maybe you can even get a little bit more prescriptive and say, well, like only monotonically increasing or something along those lines. Because the problem is like, what if I rebuilt an older version? You don't want to suddenly deploy that just because it was rebuilt for some other reason. So, you know, but there's a place for putting that in, and we could declare those needs with some really complicated stuff. All right, I think this all ties together. So directed acyclic graphs, workspaces, pipeline stuff, variations of the include. I feel like there's some other stuff too. But anyway, I think if you just pull this all together, it makes a really, really compelling vision for easy to really advanced using progressive enhancement, both from a user progressively enhancing, but also from us to implement. We could just put a bunch of small primitives together. They'll each have value independently, but then you put them together and they make a really, really good story. And it's one of those things where if you just tell people here are the features we ship, they may not really get it, but then you put it together and you're like, oh, they actually solved this huge problem. And so it becomes a documentation. Just like in some ways, like review apps. Review app doesn't exist in YAML anywhere. There's no such thing. But we absolutely have review apps. We have that capability because you put together the pieces in a certain way. And I just feel like it's that same kind of answer.
It would also be nice for evidence collection to have a more formal kind of entity model for jobs so that you collect that data as well. Not depend on it, but gather it and store it within a release. I think that could be interesting.
Yeah, that's true. It is interesting when you start looking at like sort of the bill of materials kind of, like people want to be able to, they've got multiple repos involved, multiple projects, and they need to be able to like reproduce it, but they also just need to be able to audit and say, this is exactly what went in. And as soon as you've got includes that go out, then it's like, well, I don't know, I just, whatever the version of the file was, but like, how do you have it? So the bill of materials can be like, oh, well, we take a snapshot, we know exactly what version of the include was. But then when we get into needs, you know, that's an implicit need. Like I've got an include in another file. I effectively need that file, but it is interesting. Like, what if that file changes? Should I just regenerate? Like, do I need it in that same way? Or should that trigger? Like, it'd be interesting if you looked at and said, I've got a company and we all share the same sort of common base things. And then somebody's like, oh, I'm going to bump the base level of Ubuntu. And that instantly triggers 20 pipelines because this common included file was modified. And now that just triggers a new pipeline for everybody. I don't know if that's a good thing or not, but it could be really interesting. But it ties in again to the more we are aware of what these dependencies are, the more we can do with them. All right, everybody, thank you very much for your time. Hopefully this was helpful.
Yeah, no, I mean, you've spoken directly to the product manager Verify, who likes to say really good in the middle, and we need better stuff at the beginning for new people and better stuff for advanced teams. So you've piqued my interest very a lot. So that's good. Mission accomplished on that. Also, happy birthday, Kenny.
Oh, thanks.
Happy birthday.
Happy birthday, man.
All right. Well, great. Yeah, I wrote down some notes, Mark, but I think there's more to kind of grok here. And
Yep.
I'm going to put like I think this warrants somehow maybe an epic that is this thing.
I would like to see a vision for this for CI. I mean, it's your category vision. I would love to see this folded in and somehow a story told about how these pieces come together. I know right now our category visions, we focused on the MVC part, but the intent is to tell the story. So I would love to see this as an important part of the story. There's more to it. One of these days I'll do another one of these on variables and integrations, but this is a nice epic probably contained.
Yeah.
All right, thanks everyone.
Appreciate it.
Thanks.
Ciao.